At Christmas dinner, my grandmother handed every person in my family a check for $800,000, and they all laughed in her face. 5 days before that happened, I was driving toward her cabin in Montana with no idea that the woman I loved most in my life was about to test every bond of blood I ever believed in. I kept replaying her phone call in my head as I drove. Her voice had never sounded so thin. She told me she needed everyone home for Christmas because she had a special gift and she wanted every seat at the table filled. That was all she said before hanging up. No explanation. No hint of what she meant. Just a tremble at the end of her sentence that had been chewing at me ever since. The highway stretched ahead of me under a sky that looked like it had been rubbed in cold ash. Snow was falling in slow drifting sheets, soft at first, then heavier as I moved north out of Spokane. The wipers on my old sedan fought to keep the windshield clear. Every few miles, the tires slipped just enough to remind me that I was alone on a winter road, with nothing but pine forest and rolling hills on both sides. I kept my hands tight on the wheel and tried to steady myself. For years, I had made this drive from Washington into western Montana, cutting through the narrow roads near Libby and following the river east toward Kalispell. I knew every bend and bridge, but something about this trip felt different. Like I was returning to a part of my life that was fading faster than I realized. The heater groaned as it pushed warm air at my feet, and I cracked the window to keep myself awake. The cold hit my face hard. It shocked me enough to remind me that there was no turning back now. If Grandma Eleanor needed me, I was going to be there. About 2 hours in, I tried calling her again. The phone rang once, then cut straight to voicemail. I tried a second time. Same thing. She always answered my calls, even when her hands were stiff from arthritis and she needed a minute to reach the phone. She always picked up. That silence sat heavy in the car with me. I passed a lone gas station near the Idaho border and slowed only long enough to check the signal on my phone. Still nothing. Snow collected on the roof of the car, and the lights inside the little store flickered like they might go out at any second. I told myself she must have left her phone next to the old wood stove and forgotten it while she cooked for the holiday. That thought helped for a moment. Only a moment. The farther I drove, the darker it grew. Dusk in December does not arrive gently in that part of the Northwest. 1 minute the sky hangs gray and wide, and the next the valley swallows all the light. My headlights cut through the dark, but the snow thickened, and the flakes spun like white sparks caught in some unseen wind. I turned off the main road onto the smaller county route that wound through the foothills. At that point, there were no other cars, no houses, no lights, just my tires humming across the snow-packed pavement and the sound of the engine working a little harder on the climb. Somewhere on that stretch, I remembered the winters I had spent at the cabin as a kid. I remembered the way Grandma would place a pot of apple cider on the stove and fill the whole house with cinnamon and cloves. I remembered how safe it felt sitting beside her, listening to her stories while the snow piled high outside. She had always been the one place where my life felt uncomplicated. My parents never understood her. They said she lived too simply and refused to spend money on things she needed. But she looked at life differently. She saved. She grew her own vegetables. She kept the same small cabin her husband had built with his own hands decades ago. That little house held more love than any fancy home my parents ever lived in. As I drove, I realized how guilty I felt. I had been buried in work for months, worn out from teaching and endless grading and the constant pressure of the new school year. I kept telling myself I would visit as soon as I had time. Then weeks slipped into months, and suddenly 4 months had passed without seeing her face. I hated myself for that. When the snow let up for a few minutes, the clouds thinned enough for moonlight to spill over the ridge. I followed the silver glow until I saw the turnoff for the dirt road that led to her property. The plow had not come through recently. Snow reached almost to the bottom of the car door as I eased onto the road. The trees here were taller and older than anywhere else on the drive. Their branches hung low with heavy white layers, bowing like they were greeting each other in the cold. I drove slowly, careful not to skid. Every bump and dip in the ground was hidden under snow. The tires pushed forward until I finally saw the familiar outline of her cabin through the trees. The sight of it hit me harder than I expected. The cabin looked smaller than it used to, like the years had shrunk it. A single lamp glowed faintly through the front window, warm and golden against the blue dark. The chimney let out a thin trail of smoke, so faint I thought it might disappear at any second. For a moment I sat in the car and just stared at the place. That was my real home. Not Spokane. Not the apartment with a noisy street outside. Not the classroom where I felt like a ghost most days. This was where I still belonged. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The cold bit instantly at my skin. The air felt sharp enough to slice through my jacket. My boots crunched into the snow as I crossed the front yard. The wooden steps leading to the porch creaked under my weight, just like they had every winter I spent here. The door was slightly open, not enough to see inside. Just enough for a sliver of warm light to spill out onto the porch. That small detail tightened something in my chest. Grandma never left the door open in winter, not even for a minute. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. The heat from the fireplace washed over me. The smell of pine logs and roasted vegetables filled the room. The familiar sound of the old clock on the wall ticking calmly made the place feel alive. I placed my bag near the coat rack and called out for her. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet house. I moved toward the living room and saw her sitting in her favorite rocking chair near the fire. She looked even smaller than I remembered, bundled in a thick sweater, her silver hair pulled back loosely. She turned her head when she heard my footsteps, and her eyes lit up. The way she smiled made every mile of the drive worth it. I walked to her, and she lifted her arms despite her stiffness. I leaned down and hugged her gently. She felt fragile, like she might crumble if I held her too tight. She rested her hand on my cheek and whispered that she was glad I came early. I told her I was sorry for taking so long to visit. She brushed it off with the same patient grace she had always shown me. She said she had already put a kettle on and asked if I wanted tea. I helped her to the kitchen and sat with her while she poured hot water into 2 old mugs. For a few minutes we talked about simple things. The weather, my job at the high school, the neighbor who had helped her stack firewood last week. But underneath those small conversations, something felt different. There was a heaviness in her voice, a tiredness in her movements. She kept touching my arm lightly, like she wanted to make sure I was really there. When she finally grew quiet, she looked toward the window where snow drifted softly against the glass. I waited for her to speak, but she did not. She just sat still with her hands wrapped around the mug, staring at something only she could see. I wondered what she had meant about that special gift she mentioned in her call. I wondered why she sounded so certain that she needed every single person home this year. I wondered why her hands trembled when she set her mug down on the table. I stayed there with her in that warm kitchen, trying not to let the worry show on my face, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that she was just tired, that the long winter was wearing on her. But deep down, I knew this visit was going to be different. I just did not know how different yet. I helped her back to her chair by the fire. She settled in and closed her eyes while I placed another log on the flames. The fire cracked softly and cast a warm glow across the room. Outside, the storm was gathering again. Snow pressed against the window and the trees swayed in the wind. I sat beside her and listened to the quiet. That was when the porch light flicked on by itself. I looked toward the window and saw a blur of movement crossing the yard. For a second, my chest tightened, but then headlights swept across the snow, and I heard tires grinding up the drive. My grandmother opened her eyes and exhaled like she already knew who it was. She told me the family must have arrived early. Her voice had a mix of relief and something else I could not place. I stood up and walked to the door just as the first car door slammed outside. Cold wind cut through the cabin when I pulled the door open. My father stepped inside first. Russell never waited to be invited. He brushed snow off his shoulders with short, irritated motions and scanned the room like he was checking for problems. His eyes landed on my grandmother, and he forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. My mother, Marianne, followed him in. She was already complaining under her breath about the icy road and the worn tires on their car. Dylan came next with his hood up and his hands tucked into his jacket. He barely looked at me before walking straight to the living room. My grandmother called his name softly, and he gave her a quick nod, already pulling out his phone as he sat on the couch. Then Harold and Loretta stepped in, with Kaylee behind them, taking a slow video of the cabin interior as if she was scouting for a joke to post online. I helped my grandmother stand, and she greeted each of them with a hug. Most of them bent down only halfway, offering stiff little motions that barely qualified as affection. She pretended not to notice. That was her kindness. Her curse sometimes. She kept smiling and thanking them for coming, even while the room filled with cold air from outside. We moved toward the dining table, and I slid the door shut to block out the wind. The cabin warmed again slowly. The table was already set, and my grandmother told everyone to sit wherever they liked. She had prepared a simple meal: roasted vegetables, stew, homemade bread, the sort of food she always made for Christmas. It tasted like the holidays I remembered as a kid. But the people sitting around me were not the same. They ate absent-mindedly, most of them glued to their phones or talking to each other about work, bills, sports, anything except the woman who had spent days preparing the dinner in front of them. My father complained that the heat was too strong. Loretta mentioned the smell of the wood stove like it was something unpleasant. Kaylee took a picture of her plate and whispered something to her screen that made her laugh. My grandmother moved slowly around the table, making sure everyone had enough stew, touching shoulders lightly, smiling even when there was nothing to smile about. I watched her closely. Her hands trembled a little more than usual. She seemed to lean her weight on the back of each chair as she passed. The exhaustion that I had sensed earlier was clearer now. She sat down beside me after she finished serving. Her breath was a little unsteady. I asked quietly if she wanted me to help clean after dinner, but she shook her head, saying she wanted tonight to be something everyone remembered. When I asked her what she meant, she gave me a small, weary smile and told me to wait. Halfway through the meal, she stood again, but this time she walked to the small drawer beside the kitchen counter. She opened it carefully and pulled out a neat stack of white envelopes. The room fell silent for the first time that evening. Even Dylan looked up from his phone. My grandmother walked around the table and placed one envelope in front of each person. When she reached me, she rested her hand on mine for a second longer than the others. Then she returned to her seat and folded her hands in her lap. Her voice was soft but clear as she said that she wanted to give everyone a Christmas gift they would never forget. No one knew what to make of it. My father asked what was inside. She told him to open it, so he did. One by one, everyone tore their envelope open. A quiet rustling filled the cabin. Then the silence that followed was so sharp, it felt like the air vanished. My father was the first to speak, and a short laugh burst out of him like he could not stop it. He held up a check with my grandmother's signature on it. $800,000. He stared at the number, then at her, and shook his head. He said there was no way this was real, that she must have printed these online or grabbed them from some funny template she found. Then Loretta laughed, then Harold, then Dylan joined in, showing Kaylee the check so she could record it. She lifted her phone and whispered into it that the family had received fake checks for Christmas. They all laughed louder. Every voice in the room rose above the crackle of the fire. They joked that she must be confused again, that she thought she had a fortune hidden somewhere in the woods, that she needed to rest and maybe get checked by a doctor. My grandmother sat still through all of it. She kept her hands folded and her back straight. Her eyes did not waver, but the softness in them dimmed. I could see her shrink a little inside. She had always been quiet, but this was different. This was hurt she tried to hide. I opened my envelope last because I already knew something was wrong. When I pulled out the check, I felt a strange weight in my chest. I looked at her instead of the number. She was watching me with the smallest hint of fear, like she was waiting to see if I would laugh at her too. I did not. I placed the check back into the envelope and slipped it into my jacket pocket. She saw that, and her shoulders relaxed just the slightest bit. No words passed between us, but in that moment, I knew the check was not a joke to her. Whatever this was, whatever she was doing, she needed me to trust her. My father tossed his check onto the table and said he hoped she had not wasted real money on printing something silly. Harold asked if she had been reading those financial magazines again. Kaylee uploaded the clip she had recorded. She said it was already getting views. Not one person asked why she chose that amount or how she managed to write checks at all. They only saw something they could laugh at, something to mock, something they thought they were too smart to believe. My grandmother tried to speak, but her voice got lost under theirs. She finally gave up and stared into her plate. I could not stand watching her sit there while the people she loved tore her down. I stood up and told everyone to calm down, that she had put effort into tonight, that maybe they could show some respect. No one listened. My father told me to sit and stop trying to control the room. Loretta said I was always too sensitive. Dylan smirked at me like he was daring me to say something else. I did not. The moment was beyond saving. My grandmother excused herself and walked slowly to her rocking chair. The room kept buzzing while she sat there alone near the fire. I stayed by her side. She reached for my hand and held it lightly. Her skin felt cold. The others began gathering their coats soon after. They had eaten enough. They had laughed enough. They wanted to get back to their lives. They thanked her with quick, empty phrases and hurried out into the cold night. The sound of their cars starting filled the silence they left behind. I closed the door once the last engine faded down the road. The cabin felt so still, it was like the air froze. My grandmother stayed in her chair with her fingers laced together. I knelt beside her, and she touched my cheek with a tired hand. She told me quietly that she was glad I had come early, that she needed at least one person to hear her. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she looked toward the window again, and I knew she was too tired to keep talking. I helped her stand and guided her to the table again so she could finish her tea. The porch light was still glowing outside. Snow kept falling, soft and steady. I sat across from her and waited for her to speak. She looked like she wanted to say something important, something she had carried alone for a long time. But all she said was that tomorrow would make things clearer, and then she closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength for whatever was coming next. Her words lingered in my mind long after she finished her tea. I sat with her until she drifted off in her chair, her breathing steady and light, the kind that told me she was finally letting her body rest. I lifted her gently and helped her to her bedroom, tucked the blankets around her, and turned off the lamp. As I stepped out, I took one last look at her small frame under the quilt and felt an ache settle deep in my chest. Something was wrong. She was trying to tell me without saying it out loud. The cabin grew quiet once I closed her door. I wandered through the kitchen, washed the remaining dishes, and took out the trash. Snow kept falling outside the window, covering the porch in a soft white sheet. I pulled the envelope from my jacket and set it on the counter. The check looked strange under the warm cabin light. Too clean, too perfect. $800,000. I ran my thumb across the ink, thinking about how her eyes had searched mine when I first saw it. She needed me to trust her. So I would. By the time I crawled into the guest bed, it was past midnight. The wind pushed lightly against the windows. The wood stove crackled in the next room, and I fell asleep faster than I expected. When morning came, thin light seeped through the curtains. The house was cold again, and for a second I wondered if I had overslept. I threw on a sweater and stepped into the hall. My grandmother was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of herbal tea. She looked tired but peaceful. She smiled when she saw me and told me breakfast was ready. A plate of pancakes sat on the stove, and I fixed one for myself. We ate quietly, the morning still, until she finally broke the silence. She said she knew last night had been hard on me. I told her I did not understand why they treated her that way. She touched my hand and said she understood more than I thought. People reveal themselves when money enters a room. She said it without bitterness. It scared me a little how calm she was. After breakfast, I walked outside to shovel snow from the walkway. Cold air bit at my face as I pushed the shovel across the porch. My grandmother stepped outside with a scarf around her neck, watching me like she had been waiting for this moment. She said she loved the way the snow looked before anyone disturbed it, that it reminded her of the early mornings when my grandfather was still alive. She stopped talking after that and watched in silence. I noticed the way she gripped the porch rail, like she needed it for balance. I told her she should go back inside to stay warm, but she shook her head and stayed until I was done. The rest of the morning passed in a comfortable rhythm. I fixed a loose window latch. I restacked the firewood. She followed me around the cabin offering tea, cookies, apple slices, anything to keep her hands busy. At noon she made a pot of thick soup and insisted I take the bigger bowl. She barely touched hers. I watched her movements. Every step she took seemed slower than the last. Something in her face looked fragile, like she was trying to hold herself together for my sake. In the late afternoon, the snow stopped. A pale blue sky opened above the treetops, and the air felt lighter. My grandmother asked if I would sit with her by the fire. I helped her to her chair and sat beside her. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, listening to the soft crackle of the flames. She told me she had been thinking about what happened last night. She said she was not angry at them. She was disappointed, but not angry. She said people choose what kind of heart they want to live with. Some choose kindness. Some choose what is convenient. She paused and turned her head just enough to look at me. She thanked me for not laughing at her. She said I had always been the only one who stayed. I did not know what to say, so I just held her hand. Evening settled over the cabin, and the temperature dropped. She wanted to tidy up the kitchen before bed, and I followed her in case she needed help. She insisted she was fine, but her hands shook as she reached for a plate. I took it gently and told her I would clean. She smiled and let me. While I washed dishes, she stood beside me humming an old tune she used to sing when I visited as a kid. The sound filled the kitchen in a way that made the whole world feel softer. By the time we finished, it was past 9. She said she wanted to turn in early. I walked her to her room, and she held my arm tighter than usual. When we reached the doorway, she looked up at me and said that she was grateful I had come early. She said the next few days mattered more than I realized. Before I could ask what she meant, she told me she loved me, then stepped inside and closed the door softly. I sat alone in the living room with the lamp turned low. The check was still in my jacket pocket, and I pulled it out again, The number printed on it looked unreal. I kept thinking about how everyone else had thrown theirs away, how lightly they treated her gift. I did not know if the check was real or not. What mattered was what she wanted me to believe. And I believed her. I pulled out my phone and hesitated. I wanted to call someone. Maybe my father or my brother. But I knew it would change nothing. They had made their choice. They had shown us who they were. The thought cut deeper than I expected. I slid the phone back in my pocket. Before heading to bed, I checked on my grandmother. I opened the door just enough to see her sleeping on her side. Her face relaxed, her breathing slow and steady. I stood there for a moment, letting the sight settle something inside me. Then I closed the door and walked down the hall to the guest room. The room was quiet. The cabin was peaceful. Nothing in the air suggested what was coming. I lay down and watched the shadows move across the ceiling. My thoughts drifted between last night's chaos and her quiet strength this morning. I wondered what she meant when she said tomorrow would make things clearer. Part of me hoped she would tell me everything at breakfast, but sleep would not come. The more I waited, the heavier the quiet felt. The cabin was too still. Even the wind had gone silent. I got up and paced the room, then finally sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing my hands together for warmth. A strange unease crawled through me. Not fear exactly, but something close. Something like the feeling you get when you know the next step in your life is already waiting for you, and there is no turning back. I finally lay down again and pulled the blanket over my chest. My eyes closed slowly. The last thing I remember before sleep took me was the faint sound of her cough echoing through the thin wooden walls. Her cough faded into silence, but the sound kept circling in my mind until the early light pushed through the curtains. I woke with a tight feeling in my chest, the kind that tells you something in the air has shifted. The cabin was colder than the day before, and for a moment I wondered if the fire had died out. I stepped into the hallway and noticed the floor felt colder beneath my feet. No smoke drifted from the stove, no faint smell of her tea, no soft humming coming from the kitchen. I called her name once. Then again, a little louder. No answer. A dull weight settled deep in my stomach as I walked toward her room. The door was cracked open, just enough for a sliver of light to cut across the floor. I pushed it open gently. Her blankets were folded down neatly, her pillow dented in its usual spot. But the bed was empty. I felt a jolt of relief at first. Maybe she was already in the kitchen. Maybe she had stepped outside for fresh air. I left the room and checked the kitchen. The kettle was cold. Her mug from last night was still on the counter. I opened the back door and looked at the porch. Snow covered the railing in a thin layer untouched by any footprints. I walked back inside, calling her name, louder this time. The cabin swallowed the sound. I hurried down the hallway again, checked the bathroom, checked the small storage room behind the stairs. Each room was empty and cold. My breath grew unsteady as the silence thickened. I returned to her bedroom and this time looked more carefully. Her house coat was gone from the hook. The slippers she wore every morning were not on the floor. The window near the bed was slightly open. A thin curtain drifted gently in the cold air. I rushed to it. Snow on the outer sill had been brushed aside. The marks were faint but clear. I leaned out and looked toward the small shed behind the cabin. The door stood half open. I did not think. I ran outside without grabbing a jacket. The cold hit me like a bucket of ice. My breath turned white in front of me as my feet sank into the snow. I reached the shed and pushed the door open wide. The dim light inside revealed old tools, boxes, and her favorite folding chair placed near the wall. She was not there, but her footprints were. They trailed from the shed to the tree line a short distance away. They were shallow, fragile impressions. Like each step had cost her effort. My heart pounded harder with every one I followed. I reached the trees and called out again. The woods swallowed my voice in a heavy stillness. I scanned the ground and saw her tracks continue deeper into the trees. I followed. Branches brushing my arms, cold air burning my lungs. The woods grew thicker, and I could barely see through the pale morning light. Her footprints drifted slightly to the right, toward a clearing she used to take me to when I was a kid. I remembered that place. A fallen tree that looked like a broken bench. A small patch of ground where she said the first flowers bloomed each spring. We had not walked there together in years. The memory made my chest ache. When I reached the clearing, I saw her. She was sitting on the fallen tree, wrapped in her house coat, her hands resting on her lap. Her breath fogged the air in thin, slow wisps. She looked so small against the white world around her. I ran to her and knelt at her side. She smiled faintly and told me she woke early and wanted to see the morning woods one more time. I told her she could have asked me. She said she knew I needed sleep. She looked away from me, toward the treetops, and took in a long, slow breath. I noticed how pale she was. Her hands were colder than they should have been, even in winter. I asked if she felt dizzy, if she needed help standing. She shook her head and said she was fine, but her voice trembled under the cold. I insisted we go back inside. She hesitated, but finally nodded. I helped her stand and wrapped an arm around her as we made our way through the trees. Her steps were slow and unsure. At one point, she leaned heavily against me, and I felt her body shiver. When we reached the cabin, I guided her into the kitchen and sat her near the stove. I lit the fire quickly and set water on for tea. She watched me with tired eyes. I told her she scared me, walking out alone like that. She said she did not mean to. She just felt drawn to the woods. She always had. She said she wanted a moment to breathe before she told me something important. I pulled a chair beside her and waited. She looked at the floor, then at her hands, then finally at me. Her voice shook when she spoke. She said she had not been feeling well for a long time. She said the dizziness came more often, that her body tired quicker than she admitted. I asked if she had seen a doctor. She hesitated too long before telling me yes. Once. A long time ago. She did not tell me what he said at first, but the way her eyes lowered told me enough. I reached for her hand. She held mine gently but weakly. She said she did not want to burden me. She said she had lived a long life. She said she had been preparing for whatever came next. I told her I would take her to a doctor the moment we got back to Oak Bend. She smiled sadly and told me it would not change anything now. Those words hit me like a blow. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand answers. But she lifted her hand and touched my cheek with a soft, fragile motion. She said she needed me to listen, that what she was about to tell me mattered more than anything else. She told me the checks were real. Her voice grew steadier as she explained that she and my grandfather had saved, invested, and lived carefully for decades. They had built a small fortune quietly. She said she wanted to leave her family a gift, but needed to know who still had a real heart for her, not for her money. I sat there frozen, my thoughts tangling. I thought of the laughter last night, the jokes, the way each one tossed their check aside like trash. My stomach twisted. She said she gave everyone the same amount, but only one check would ever clear. She said she expected her family to treat her gift with something more than ridicule. She said she wanted to see who held on, who respected her enough to believe in her one last time. I felt the weight of the envelope in my jacket like it was filled with lead instead of paper. She looked into my eyes then, her own tired but clearer than I had seen in days. She said she knew exactly who would keep the check. I wanted to speak, but the words caught in my throat. She smiled faintly before she stood. She said she wanted to rest in her room for a bit. I helped her walk down the hallway. Her grip on my arm was feather light, almost like she was fading with every step. When she reached her bedroom, she turned to me and told me to leave the check somewhere safe. She said tomorrow would decide everything. The way she said it made my chest tighten with fear I could not name. She closed the door softly, and I was left standing alone in the hallway, holding onto a silence that felt too heavy for the walls to carry. I stepped back into the kitchen and stared at the fire. The crackle of burning wood was the only sound in the cabin. Outside, the sky had darkened again, even though the day was barely half over. Snow clouds gathered low and heavy above the trees as if the whole world was bracing for something. And inside the cabin, my grandmother rested behind a thin wooden door, while I stood staring at the envelope on the table, no longer able to ignore the cold knot twisting tighter inside me. The knot in my stomach tightened until I could barely breathe. I picked up the envelope again and held it in my hands. The paper felt heavier than it should. The number printed on that check sat in my mind like a weight I could not shake. I slipped it into my pocket and paced around the kitchen. The fire snapped in the stove, sending warm flickers of orange across the room. But none of it eased the cold settling inside me. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the counter, then stacking firewood beside the stove. But my thoughts kept circling back to her voice when she said tomorrow would decide everything. It echoed inside me like a warning. I checked on her once more. I opened the door quietly and found her asleep. Her breathing was shallow but even. Her hands rested on the blanket. She looked at peace but fragile in a way that made something deep inside me twist with fear. I backed out and closed the door gently. Hours passed. Snow piled against the porch. The light faded. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I did not drink. The silence pressed harder with every passing minute. I needed clarity, something, anything. Eventually, I took out my phone. I stared at it long enough that the screen dimmed. Then I searched for the nearest bank branch in town. One was open until late afternoon, a small community branch across from the grocery store. If the check was real, they would tell me. If it was not, I could at least stop wondering. I grabbed my jacket, stepped into the cold, and brushed snow off my truck. The engine coughed before starting. I turned around and looked at the cabin. The windows glowed weakly from the fire inside. I hesitated, thinking I should wake her and tell her where I was going. But she needed rest more than anything. I promised myself I would be back fast. The drive into town took 15 minutes. The roads were slushy, the sky low and gray. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. I pulled into a space and sat there for a moment, staring at the building. My breath fogged the air inside the truck. My hands trembled as I reached into my pocket. I walked into the bank with the envelope held tight. A young teller greeted me from behind the counter. She had a warm smile that faded the moment she saw the check. Her expression shifted from polite to confused to something close to uneasy. She told me to hold on while she got her manager. A moment later, a man in a dark sweater stepped out of an office. He introduced himself and asked to see the check. He studied it closely, turning it under the light, tracing his finger along the signature. His jaw tightened just barely. Then he asked if we could speak in private. He led me to his small office and closed the door. My pulse hammered in my ears. He looked from the check to me and asked where I had gotten it. I told him my grandmother wrote it for me on Christmas Eve. He asked if I knew anything about her accounts at First National. I said no. He nodded slowly like he was choosing his next words very carefully. He said the check matched a high balance account at the main branch. The owner was listed as my grandmother. He said the routing and account numbers were correct. He said nothing looked forged. He said he would need to run verification that could take several days. But in his opinion, the check was legitimate. I sat there stunned. Relief hit me first, then disbelief, then a cold shock that spread through me from the inside out. He asked if I wanted to deposit it. I hesitated, then nodded. He processed the paperwork and gave me a printed receipt. He said the check would need to clear and that I should expect a hold. He thanked me for coming in and told me to have a good afternoon, though his voice sounded strained, like he could still not quite believe what he had seen. When I walked back into the parking lot, the snow had stopped. The sky looked clearer, but everything inside me felt heavier, more tangled, real. The check was real. The money was real. My grandmother had been telling the truth, and no one else had believed her. As I drove back to the cabin, I kept replaying the scene at dinner. Their laughter, their jokes, their dismissive looks, the way they had thrown the checks aside like scraps of paper, and the way she had watched them with a quiet sadness she tried to hide. By the time I reached the narrow road to the cabin, I felt something sharp lodged in my chest. Guilt, anger, grief, all tangled together. When I stepped inside the cabin, the warmth hit my face. The fire was still burning softly. I called her name. No answer. A faint dread crept up my spine. I walked quickly down the hallway and pushed open her door. She was lying in bed, eyes closed, but her face looked more strained than earlier. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. I knelt by her side and called her softly. Her eyelids fluttered open. She looked at me through a haze. I told her I had gone into town for a little while. She nodded weakly. I told her I had taken the check to the bank. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes searched mine with a quiet understanding. She whispered that it was good I had gone. She said she wanted me to see the truth for myself. She said it was time. A lump formed in my throat. I told her she needed a doctor. She shook her head gently and said there was no point. She said she had made her peace with everything, that she knew her time was close. She said she had wanted it to be me who stayed, me who heard her last wishes, me who understood why she had done what she did. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her she would be fine tomorrow. But her eyes were too clear, too calm. She knew. She had known. She held my hand with what little strength she had left. She told me not to be afraid. She told me she had lived a good life. She told me she was proud of me. She told me she loved me more than she had ever said out loud. Her voice grew softer with each word. I stayed by her side for hours. I watched the light dim outside. I listened to her breaths grow slower. In the quiet, she looked peaceful, like she was drifting into sleep. I kept my hand in hers, afraid to let go. At some point, I must have rested my head on the edge of the bed. I do not know how long I stayed like that. When I lifted my head, the room was darker. The air felt still in a way that told me something had changed. I leaned in closer. Her chest was no longer rising. The breath left my lungs in a single painful rush. I grabbed her hand. It felt colder than before. I called her name again and again, each time softer than the last, until the cabin swallowed my voice completely. I do not remember how long I cried. I only remember the silence, the kind that feels final, the kind that wraps around you and does not let go. When I finally reached for my phone, my hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. I dialed for help, even though part of me already knew it was too late. When the operator answered, I could barely speak. My voice broke as I told her my grandmother needed assistance. When I ended the call, I sat beside the bed again. I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. I whispered that I was there, that she was not alone. Snow began to fall again outside, soft and quiet. like the world had slowed down out of respect. I sat there watching her face, feeling the cold creep into the room, not ready to step into the world beyond that door, not ready to face what would come next. The cold kept spreading through the room until it felt like it had settled inside my bones. The paramedics arrived 20 minutes after my call. Red and blue lights flickered across the snow outside. Two men stepped into the cabin with quiet voices and calm expressions. They asked a few questions, checked her pulse, looked at each other, and one of them placed a hand on my shoulder. He said they were sorry. He said she had been gone for some time. I nodded, but the words felt distant, like they were drifting through water. They lifted her gently and took her away. I stood in the doorway as the stretcher rolled through the snow. The cold air hit my face hard. The door swung lightly in the wind behind me. When the van pulled away, its lights disappearing into the dark, the cabin fell into a silence so complete it felt painful. I stepped back inside and locked the door. The house felt hollow now, the air too still. Her blanket was still folded on the bed, her slippers still beside the chair. I walked through each room slowly, touching the back of a chair, the kitchen counter, the handle of the stove. Every little thing felt like a piece of her still hanging in the air. When I reached the dining table, I noticed a white envelope sitting there, my name written in her slanted hand. For a moment I could not move. My legs felt heavy, like the floor was shifting beneath me. I reached out and picked it up. The paper felt warm from the firelight. I sat down and opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter written on the same lined paper she always used. The first line hit me so hard my eyes blurred. She said she hoped I would read her words with calm, even if calm might be impossible right now. She wrote that she knew her time was near and that she had no fear of it. She said she had lived a life filled with moments she cherished and that she was grateful I was part of those moments. She wrote about the money. She said she wanted to leave a gift to those she loved, but also wanted to understand what lived in their hearts. She said she expected the reaction she got from the family. She said she hoped, with a kind of quiet certainty, that I would be the one to keep the check safe. She said she trusted me with what she valued most, not just the money, but the meaning behind it. She wrote that only one check would clear and that she wanted it to be mine. She said she believed I would use it well and that I would live in a way that honored her memory. Then the words shifted. She spoke of regret, that she wished she had told me sooner about her health, that she did not want to burden me with worry, that she knew I had enough weight on my shoulders already. She wrote that she felt peace knowing I had been there with her during her final days. She wrote that I had given her more comfort than I realized. The last lines were written with a softer hand. She wrote that she loved me. She wrote that she hoped I would forgive her for leaving the world without saying goodbye in the morning. She wrote that she would always be with me in the quiet places, in the warm light of the cabin, in every good thing that came after. I set the letter down and covered my face with my hands. My chest tightened. I could not hold it in anymore. The sound that came out of me was nothing like normal crying. It felt like something tearing loose inside. The tears burned hot against my palms. It went on until my throat hurt and my breath came in uneven bursts. Eventually, I stood and wiped my face. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I walked to the window and looked outside. Snow had begun falling again in slow, drifting flakes, settling softly on the path leading away from the cabin. The world outside looked untouched, like nothing had happened at all. I stayed by the window for a long time. When I finally stepped away, the cabin felt different, not empty in the same way. Something stronger than grief was pushing inside me, something sharper, a pressure rising inside my chest that I could not ignore. I grabbed my phone and pulled up my father's number. My hand shook as I pressed call. It rang twice before he answered. His voice sounded annoyed, like I had interrupted something important. I could barely form the words. I said that she was gone. There was a short silence. Then he asked if there was a will. Not how she looked. Not if she suffered. Not if I was all right. Only that. I hung up before he finished speaking. I did not trust myself to listen to a single word more. I called my brother next. When he picked up, he sounded half asleep. I told him she had passed. He said nothing at first. Then he asked if the check I kept was real. My grip tightened on the phone. I hung up on him too. I called Harold and Loretta. Same reaction. No sorrow, no shock, only questions about her money and her house. I ended each call quicker than the last. By the time I finished the final call, anger burned in my stomach like something alive. Not the wild kind of anger that makes you yell. Something steadier, something colder, something that settles with purpose. I walked into her room and sat in her chair. The blanket still smelled faintly of her lavender soap. I held the letter against my chest and let the silence fill the room. Somewhere beneath all the grief, a thought formed. A small seed at first, but clear. They had laughed at her. They had mocked her. They had thrown her gift into the trash. And now, even in her death, they cared only about what they could take from her. I felt a line inside me shift. Something that had always bent finally straightened. I whispered into the quiet room that I would honor her wishes. Then I whispered something else. A promise I had never meant to speak aloud, but knew I would keep. I said I would not let them stain her memory. Not with their greed, not with their lies, not with their carelessness. Outside, the snow thickened, falling fast now, covering everything in white. The cabin creaked softly, the old wood shifting with the cold. I stood, walked to the stove, and fed more logs into the fire. The flames rose, warming the kitchen again. I sat down, opened her letter one more time, and read the last line until it carved itself into my mind. When the fire had burned high enough to chase the cold from the air, I folded the letter and placed it in my jacket. Then I stepped outside into the falling snow. The night felt different, heavy, waiting. Somewhere out in that darkness, the world was about to change. Snow collected on my shoulders as I walked away from the cabin and headed toward my truck. My breath rose in slow white clouds. The night was so still I could hear the faint pop of ice shifting on the branches overhead. I opened the door, sat in the driver's seat, and let the engine warm while I stared at the empty road stretching into the dark. Grief sat heavy in my chest, but something harder had begun to take shape under it. A purpose, a line I knew I would not back away from. I drove to town at a careful pace. The snow was thick enough to hide patches of ice, and the last thing I wanted was to end up in a ditch. The main street was nearly empty. Only a few storefronts glowed under the dim winter lamps. I parked in front of the small motel where the funeral director was waiting for me. He stepped out into the cold and shook my hand with a quiet sympathy that felt far more real than anything I had heard from my family earlier. We talked about arrangements, simple ones. Exactly what my grandmother would have wanted. Nothing excessive, no polished casket or elaborate displays. She had always said that people should not waste money trying to pretend death was grand. She wanted the truth, even in the end. When everything was set, I stepped back out into the cold and leaned against my truck, letting the snow settle into my hair. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I looked at the screen and saw my father's name. I did not want to answer, but I did. His voice came through quickly, impatient, thick with an edge I had grown to recognize too well. He asked again about the will. He asked about the money, asked if she had left anything to him. He said the cabin surely counted for something. I stayed silent until my jaw ached from clenching. When he paused, I told him her funeral would be held the next morning. I told him I did not want arguments at her service. He said he would be there. He said the family deserved to know exactly what she had left behind. The words stung enough that I ended the call without a goodbye. The drive back felt longer. The snow fell harder. By the time the cabin came into view, the porch light glowed through the dark like a beacon. I walked inside and hung my coat to dry. The fire had died down, but there was enough warmth left to soften the air. Sleep was out of reach. I sat on the couch with her letter in my hands, reading her words again and again. Each line guided my anger into something steady, something controlled, something ready. Morning arrived without me noticing I had drifted off. Pale light crept across the floor. I stood slowly, joints stiff, and made a pot of coffee. The cabin felt like a hollow shell without her. Every sound echoed. By the time I left for the church, the snow had stopped. The sky was a faded blue, and the air held a sharp cold that cut through my jacket. The small white church sat at the edge of town, quiet and humble, just like she always preferred. When I stepped inside, the scent of old wood and candle wax hit me. A few townspeople were already seated. They greeted me softly, each of them offering real condolences, not the shallow kind I had heard from my parents. Then the door at the back opened, and my family walked in. My father moved first, wearing an expensive dark coat and carrying himself like he expected the service to revolve around him. My mother followed in long sunglasses, even though the room was dim. My brother trailed behind, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Harold and Loretta came next, Kaylee walking close behind with a tense look on her face. They barely glanced at the coffin. Instead, they scanned the room with the same calculating look they used at gatherings when they wanted to know who might be watching. My jaw tightened. The service began. The pastor spoke gently. He talked about her kindness, her quiet strength, the way she had helped neighbors through hard winters and never asked for anything in return. As he talked, I felt memories rise like warm smoke inside me. The nights she tucked me in when I visited, the sound of her laughter when I helped her cook, the way she told stories like they were gifts. When it was my turn to speak, I walked slowly to the front. My hands trembled, but my voice held firm as I talked about the last days I spent with her, about the quiet mornings, about the courage she showed even when she knew her time was short. I did not mention the checks or the test she had set. That belonged to me and to her, not to the people who had thrown their chance away. When I finished and stepped down, I caught the look on my father's face. He was not touched. He was impatient. After the service ended, the pastor asked immediate family to stay for a meeting with the attorney handling her affairs. A few townsfolk remained in the hallway offering condolences while my family and I followed the pastor into a small room behind the sanctuary. The attorney, a calm man in his 60s, opened a folder and adjusted his glasses. He began explaining that my grandmother had transferred her remaining assets into a single account before Christmas. He said she had left a written instruction stating that the first valid check presented against that account would determine the sole recipient of the funds. My father stiffened. My mother sucked in a breath. My brother froze like he had been hit with cold water. The attorney continued reading. He said the account held $800,000. He said the first check that had been deposited was mine. My father exploded. He shouted that it was impossible, that she would never do something so cruel. Loretta demanded the will be read again, Harold said this sounded illegal. Kaylee stepped back like she wanted to disappear into the wall. My brother glared at me like I had stolen something from him personally. The attorney raised both hands and said this was her clear written intention. He said she had signed everything personally while fully aware of her decisions. He said the bank had already confirmed the processing of the check. My father moved across the room so fast I thought he might strike me. His face was red, his voice low and sharp as he told me to hand over the money. He said family shared everything. He said it was only fair. Fair. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. I looked at each of them. They had ignored her, mocked her, laughed at her, and now they saw her final gift as something owed to them. I told my father no. He shouted again, louder this time, and the pastor stepped between us. My mother started crying, but even her tears felt thin, like she was performing. Harold threatened legal action. Loretta said I had manipulated her. My brother said I had taken advantage of a dying woman. Each accusation hit like a strike to the ribs, not because I believed them, but because I saw so clearly the distance between us. The attorney gathered his papers and said the matter was closed. There was no room for discussion, no room for negotiation. The room went silent, except for the sound of my father breathing hard through his nose. His eyes were fixed on me, filled with a hate I had never seen from him before. He told me this was not over. I walked out of the church without looking back. The cold air hit my face as I stepped onto the snow-covered path. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the ground. People were leaving in small groups, their footsteps soft in the snow. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the icy air, letting the quiet settle around me. Something deep inside me shifted again. Not grief this time. Not anger. Something colder, something steadier. Something ready for the next storm that was already gathering on the horizon. I knew the fight had only started. I walked away from the church with the cold cutting into my lungs, but the air felt cleaner than it had in days. I reached my truck and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel while the weight of everything pressed down on me. My family had just shown me exactly who they were. People who could stand in front of my grandmother's coffin and think only about what they believed they were owed. People who could twist her final wish into an accusation. People who would rather tear me apart than face their own guilt. I sat there until the last cars left the lot. When I finally drove off, I headed toward the cabin to gather the last of her things. Snow flurries drifted across the windshield. The wooded road looked dim and colorless. The tires made soft crunches in the packed snow. By the time the cabin appeared through the trees, the sun had slipped behind clouds and the porch light glowed faintly. Inside, the air felt still. The warmth from the stove was gone. I stepped through each room slowly. Her knitting basket beside the couch, her folded blanket on the bed, a pair of gloves next to the back door. Every little thing carried a memory. I packed a few items in a small box. Her old journal, her favorite scarf, a picture of her and my grandfather taken decades ago. Nothing else. The house deserved to remain the way she left it. Before leaving, I stood in her room with my hand on the bedpost. I whispered a quiet promise that I would protect what she left behind. Not just the money, but the meaning of it. Then I locked the door for the last time and walked to the truck. My phone vibrated again. A number I did not recognize. The message came through in a rush, a screenshot from a social media post. My brother had uploaded a long rant calling me a thief. He said I had tricked her, that I had hidden her illness, that I had manipulated a dying woman for money. Comments flooded under his post, friends agreeing, strangers chiming in, someone tagging my workplace, someone tagging people I barely knew. Then more messages. My father calling me a liar. My mother pleading for a share of the estate. Harold writing that he would sue if I did not split it evenly. Loretta claiming she would fight until everything was taken from me. They all spoke as if grief had never touched them. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel. Their words did not break me. They hardened something inside me. They had crossed a line so completely there was no returning from it. I drove into town and parked outside the only cafe still open. The bell over the door jingled as I walked inside. A few locals were scattered at tables. They nodded at me softly. Word had already spread. People in small towns talk quietly, but truth moves fast. I ordered nothing. I went to the back booth and took out my phone again. I scrolled through every accusation, every lie, every twisting of her final days. Each one felt like a strike, but none of them landed where they hoped. My anger had cooled into something sharper than heat. I was no longer reacting. I was planning. I called Nathan, my closest friend from college, now a respected attorney in Denver. He picked up on the second ring and asked if I was all right. I told him everything. The checks, the laughter, her passing, the letter, the will, the explosion at the church, the online attacks, the threats to sue. His voice hardened. He told me I needed to come to his office the next day. He said to save everything. Screenshots, messages, posts. He said this was not a case of family infighting, but defamation, harassment, malicious intent. He told me he would take the case himself. A weight lifted from my shoulders, just enough to breathe. That night I slept at a small motel near Oak Bend. The room was plain. A single lamp, a stiff bed. But it was quiet. I pulled out her letter from my jacket and placed it on the nightstand. Her handwriting seemed to glow in the warm light, steady and sure. I read it again until my eyes blurred. Her words guided me through the heavy thoughts pressing on my mind. Morning came early. I left the motel before sunrise and began the long drive back to Denver. Snow dusted the roads, but melted as I reached the highway. The city lights appeared on the horizon by mid-morning. I parked outside Nathan's downtown office and stepped inside. He greeted me with a strong handshake and brought me to a private conference room. We spent hours going through everything. He read her letter carefully. He examined the receipt from the bank. He reviewed the online posts twice. He shook his head slowly as he scanned the comments. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me my grandmother had been a wise woman. She had protected me even in her absence. He drafted a formal response demanding removal of every defamatory statement. Then he began preparing a countersuit for damages. He said we would not back down. Not this time. He told me the law stood firmly on my side, and that her wishes would not be twisted by desperation or greed. As he spoke, I felt something inside me settle. Not peace exactly, something steadier, something like standing on solid ground again. I returned to my apartment that evening. The place felt unfamiliar after the days spent in the cabin. I placed her letter gently on my desk and sat down beside it. I stared at the wall for a long time, while the city noise buzzed outside the window. In the weeks that followed, the storm broke across my family's lives. Their posts were flagged, their accusations dismantled publicly. People began turning on them. Neighbors, co-workers, friends. All those who had once laughed with them now questioned them. They had exposed themselves for what they were, and the consequences spread through their lives louder than anything I could have said. I stayed quiet. I let the truth speak for itself. I focused on my new life. I prepared to transfer schools the next semester. I visited Oak Bend again for the final paperwork on the cabin. A part of me wanted to keep it exactly as she left it. Another part knew the memories were enough. 1 year later, I used a small portion of the money to establish a scholarship fund. The rest I kept safe. Just as she wrote, I learned to live without the noise of family expectations. I learned to breathe without waiting for someone to take something from me. I learned the value of a quiet morning and the strength that comes from standing alone. Sometimes I still dream of her, sitting in her rocking chair, smiling softly, the firelight warm on her face. And in those dreams, she is proud. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story touched something in you, let me know your thoughts in the comments and stay close for more stories like this.